When a millionaire is caught carrying a frightened girl in an abandoned lot, the town goes into meltdown with rumors. A reclusive ex-millionaire, he had abandoned everything without explanation to live in the shadows with Melanie, a 6-year-old child with deep traumas and episodes of emotional paralysis. But before I tell you this story, subscribe to the channel for more videos like this. Continuing. The late August heat pressed down on the abandoned industrial district of Bedford-Stuyvesant like a heavy blanket, its emptiness broken only by the hurried footsteps of a man carrying a small bundle wrapped in what appeared to be an old sheet. Thomas Ramirez, once celebrated in New York's financial circles for his quiet but remarkable ascent to wealth, now moved through the shadows of derelict warehouses with a desperation that seemed foreign to his usual calculated demeanor. His expensive suit, now wrinkled and stained, clung to his body in the oppressive humidity. In his arms, a little girl no more than 6 years old lay quiet, her face smudged with dirt, and her eyes holding a vacancy that spoke of depths no child should know. Her small fingers clutched the fabric of his shirt with an intensity that betrayed her silence. A passing delivery truck driver caught sight of them, and Thomas instinctively turned away, quickening his pace. But it was too late. The driver had already pulled out his phone, capturing the strange scene of a well-known millionaire carrying a disheveled child through one of Brooklyn's most desolate areas. Within hours, the image would spread across social media like wildfire, spawning countless theories and accusations. None of them would come close to the truth. 6 months earlier, Thomas had been at the pinnacle of his success. His investment firm had just closed another record-breaking quarter, and his face had graced the cover of several business magazines. But that was before the rainy night in the parking garage of his Manhattan high-rise, before he found Melanie huddled in a corner, wrapped in an oversized coat, her silent tears matching the rhythm of the falling rain. He should have called the police immediately. He had reached for his phone several times that night, but something in the girl's eyes stopped him. They held a familiar pain, one he recognized from his own reflection decades ago in the mirrors of state-run group homes and foster families who saw him as nothing more than a monthly check. Now, as they moved through the abandoned lot, Thomas's mind raced through their options. The small backpack he carried contained their meager provisions, some water bottles, packaged snacks, and basic medical supplies. He'd learned early on about Melanie's condition, the neurological disorder that caused her to freeze up emotionally, trapping her in a prison of silence. The episodes were becoming more frequent, and he lived in constant fear of the next one. They reached an old storage facility, its metal walls rusted but still standing firm against time. Thomas had discovered it weeks ago during his careful planning, knowing they might need a place to hide. He guided Melanie through a small opening he'd prepared, careful to avoid the sharp edges of the metal sheeting. Inside, the air was stale but cooler. He'd set up a small space with sleeping bags, battery-powered lanterns, and other necessities. It wasn't much, but it was safer than their previous hideouts. Melanie settled into her sleeping bag without a sound, her movements mechanical, practiced. Thomas sat beside her, gently brushing the hair from her face. In the dim light of the lantern, he could see the slight tremor in her hands, an early warning sign of an impending episode. His heart clenched. They couldn't risk going to a hospital. Not now. Not when he'd discovered how deep the web of lies around her past went. The truth had started unraveling 3 weeks ago when he'd finally managed to trace the woman who had been posing as Melanie's mother. She was a professional caregiver, hired by someone whose identity remained hidden behind layers of shell companies and false names. But Thomas had seen enough in his years of business to recognize the patterns. Someone powerful wanted Melanie, hidden, and they had resources to make problems disappear. As night fell over Brooklyn, Thomas watched Melanie drift into an uneasy sleep. The weight of his recent decisions pressed heavily on his conscience. He'd liquidated his assets, sold his controlling shares in the firm, abandoned his penthouse, all to protect this child who legally wasn't his responsibility. The business world was buzzing with speculation about his sudden withdrawal from public life, but none of that mattered now. In the distance, sirens wailed, and Thomas tensed. Each sound could mean discovery. Each shadow could hide those who wanted to take Melanie away. He pulled out a worn photograph he'd found among Melanie's few possessions, a blurry image of a woman whose features seemed to hold answers to questions he hadn't yet fully formed. Tomorrow, they would need to move. Again. The storage facility wouldn't be safe for long, especially now that his image was circulating online. But for tonight, in this metal box that smelled of rust and abandonment, they had shelter. And for Thomas, who had spent decades building walls around himself with wealth and success, that was enough. Because for the first time since his own childhood, he felt something real, a purpose that transcended the empty pursuit of fortune that had defined his life until now. The following morning brought no relief from the suffocating heat. Thomas woke to find Melanie already sitting up, her small fingers methodically arranging and rearranging a set of colored buttons she'd been carrying since he found her. The sight made his chest tighten. It was her way of seeking control when everything else felt chaotic. As he watched her, memories of his own childhood surfaced unbidden. The state home in Massachusetts where he'd spent his teenage years had smelled of industrial cleaner and lost hopes. He remembered arranging his few possessions in perfect lines, just as Melanie did now, trying to create order in a world that had abandoned him. A notification sound from his burner phone shattered the morning silence. Thomas quickly checked it, his heart racing. The image of him carrying Melanie had gone viral overnight. Local news outlets were running stories about the mysterious millionaire and the possible kidnapping. Some speculated about mental breakdown, others about criminal involvement. None of them knew how close their presence in this storage facility had come to being discovered. He'd been careful in covering their tracks, but his years in the financial world had taught him that money left trails, and trails could be followed. The woman who had been posing as Melanie's mother, Sarah Henderson as she called herself, had disappeared completely after cashing out a substantial wire transfer from an offshore account. But before vanishing, she'd left behind a crucial piece of information, a medical record with a partial history of Melanie's condition. The documentation detailed episodes of catatonic-like states triggered by emotional trauma, but the cause was carefully omitted. Thomas had seen enough redacted documents in his career to recognize deliberate information suppression. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide Melanie's past. "Time for breakfast," he whispered, pulling out some fruit and granola bars from their supplies. Melanie abandoned her buttons and took the food without meeting his eyes. She ate mechanically, each movement precise and measured, as if she'd learned early that even the simple act of eating needed to be controlled. While she ate, Thomas reflected on the events that had led them here. After finding her that rainy night, he'd tried multiple times to take her to authorities. Each attempt ended the same way. As they approached police stations or social services, offices, Melanie would begin trembling uncontrollably, her eyes glazing over with such profound terror that Thomas couldn't bring himself to follow through. The first major episode he witnessed had occurred when a police siren wailed nearby. Melanie had frozen completely, her body rigid, tears streaming silently down her face, while her mind seemed to retreat to some unreachable place. It had taken hours for her to emerge from that state, and when she did, the trust in her eyes when she looked at him had sealed his fate. He couldn't abandon her to a system he knew would fail her. A distant metallic clang made them both jump. Thomas quickly moved to the small gap in the wall that served as their window. Through it, he could see workers beginning their day at a nearby construction site. They were too close. They needed to move. As he began quietly packing their belongings, his hand brushed against an old newspaper he'd been keeping. The headline spoke of his own dramatic fall from grace. "Ramirez Empire Crumbles. CEO's Sudden Asset Liquidation Raises Questions." The article painted him as either a criminal or a madman, suggesting investigations into possible fraud or money laundering. If they only knew the truth, that he'd sold everything not out of guilt or fear, but to ensure he could protect Melanie without leaving a financial trail. The millions he'd converted to cash were hidden in various locations, small amounts that wouldn't trigger banking alerts. It was ironic how his business acumen, once used to build wealth, now served to help them disappear. Melanie watched him pack with the same intense focus she gave to her buttons. When he handed her the small backpack they designated as hers, she took it without protest, falling into the routine they'd established over the past months. Move, hide, survive, repeat. But as they prepared to leave their temporary shelter, Thomas noticed something different in Melanie's demeanor. Her hands had started to shake more violently than usual, and her breathing had become shallow. The signs were unmistakable. Another episode was approaching, and this one promised to be severe. They couldn't move, not with her in this state. But staying put meant risking discovery, especially now that their image was spreading across every social media platform in the city. As if to emphasize their predicament, the sound of approaching voices drifted through the gap in the wall, and Thomas watched in growing horror as two men in security uniforms began their morning patrol of the abandoned lot. Thomas held his breath as the security guard's footsteps crunched on the gravel outside. Inside their metal sanctuary, Melanie's condition was deteriorating rapidly. Her small body had gone rigid, eyes fixed on some distant point only she could see. The morning light filtering through the gaps in the wall cast strange shadows across her frozen features. With practiced care, he wrapped her in the old blanket they'd been carrying since their first night on the run. Her skin felt cool despite the morning heat, a telling sign of the severity of this episode. The voices outside grew closer, and Thomas could make out fragments of their conversation, something about checking the storage units for squatters. Time seemed to slow as he weighed their options. The back of the unit had a small gap, leading to a narrow passage between buildings, but moving Melanie in her current state would be nearly impossible. She was completely unresponsive now, lost in whatever darkness her mind retreated to during these episodes. The decision was made for him when one of the guards rattled the main door of their unit. Thomas gathered Melanie in his arms, her body stiff as a board, and inched toward their escape route. The metal groaned as the guards began their inspection, and Thomas could hear them discussing the signs of habitation they'd noticed. Just as they slipped through the gap, the main door creaked open. Thomas pressed himself against the wall of the adjacent building. Melanie clutched tightly to his chest. Her breathing was so shallow he could barely feel it, and for a terrifying moment, he feared the stress had pushed her condition beyond its limits. They spent the next hour navigating the maze of abandoned buildings, moving further into the industrial district. The summer sun beat down mercilessly as Thomas carried Melanie's unresponsive form, his own body screaming in protest. Finally, they found shelter in the basement of an old textile factory, its windows blocked by years of grime and neglect. As he laid Melanie down on their emergency blanket, memories of his own past surged forward. Memories he'd spent decades burying under spreadsheets and profit margins. He remembered the day his mother left him at the state home, promising to return once she got back on her feet. She never did. The pain of that abandonment had driven him to build his empire, as if accumulating wealth could fill the void left by broken promises. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent his life avoiding emotional attachments, and now, here he was risking everything for a child who wasn't his. But seeing Melanie trapped in her own private hell awakened something in him that no business deal ever had. A desperate need to protect, to heal, to make right what someone else had broken. Hours passed in the dim basement as Thomas watched over Melanie's still form. He used the time to check their burner phone, and what he found made his blood run cold. Local news stations were running his photo alongside sensationalized headlines about kidnapping and mental breakdown. Worse, they'd somehow connected him to Sarah Henderson, the fake mother, and were spinning elaborate theories about criminal conspiracies. But buried in the media frenzy was a detail that caught his attention. A small article about an elderly woman who had been seeking information about her missing granddaughter. The piece was brief, just a few lines in a local community paper, but something about it nagged at him. The timing aligned with Melanie's appearance in his life. As evening approached, Melanie finally began showing signs of emerging from her catatonic state. Her fingers twitched first, then her eyes began to track movement. Thomas had learned that these transitions were delicate. Too much stimulation could trigger another episode. He kept his distance but remained within her sight, letting her orient herself gradually. When she finally sat up, the look in her eyes was different. There was recognition there, but also something else, fear, deeper than her usual anxiety. She reached for her backpack with trembling hands and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper he'd never seen before. As she smoothed it out on the concrete floor, Thomas felt his heart skip a beat. It was a photograph, older than the one he'd found among her possessions. In it, a younger version of the woman from the news article stood smiling next to a man whose face had been deliberately scratched out. And there, held in the woman's arms, was an infant wrapped in a distinctive blanket, the same blanket Melanie now clutched to her chest. The pieces were starting to come together, but Thomas knew from experience that the truth often came with a price. As night fell, over their hidden sanctuary, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Somewhere in the city, forces were moving against them, and the fragile peace they'd found in their flight was about to shatter. The basement of the textile factory grew colder as night settled in, despite the lingering summer heat above. Thomas studied the photograph in the dim light of their battery-powered lantern, his mind racing to connect the dots. Melanie sat nearby, her small body swaying slightly as she recovered from her episode, her eyes fixed on the concrete floor. The woman in the photo, who he now suspected was Melanie's grandmother, had a warmth in her eyes that spoke of home and safety. But the violently scratched-out face beside her suggested a darker story. Thomas had seen similar defacement in photos during his time in the group homes. Children dealing with trauma often expressed their pain this way. Their quiet contemplation was interrupted by the sound of Melanie's stomach growling. Their food supplies were running dangerously low. Thomas had been careful with their cash, knowing that using credit cards or ATMs would leave a trail. But he hadn't anticipated being forced to abandon their previous hideout so quickly. They had enough for maybe 2 more days if they rationed carefully. Melanie's face had grown gaunt over the past weeks, her clothes hanging looser on her small frame. The sight filled Thomas with a gnawing guilt. He'd given up everything to protect her. But was he really doing what was best for her? The question haunted him as he watched her pick listlessly at the last granola bar they would share that night. A sudden burst of voices from the street above made them both freeze. Through the grimy basement windows, they could see the bobbing beams of flashlights. Thomas quickly extinguished their lantern, plunging them into darkness. Melanie's breathing became rapid and shallow, the beginning signs of another episode. He moved to her silently, wrapping his arms around her trembling form. This close, he could feel her heart racing, her small body fighting against the paralysis that threatened to overtake her again. They couldn't afford another episode. Not now. Not with unknown threats so close. "Focus on my heartbeat," he whispered. A technique they'd discovered helped sometimes. Just like the buttons, one beat at a time. He felt her fingers clutch his shirt, counting the rhythmic thumps against his chest. Slowly, gradually, her breathing began to steady. The voices above grew closer. Through the thick glass, Thomas could make out fragments of conversation. Checked the warehouse district. Tip about squatters. Reward for information. His blood ran cold. Someone was actively looking for them. They remained motionless in the darkness for what felt like hours, until the voices and flashlights finally moved away. But the damage was done. This hiding place was compromised too. They would have to move again, and soon. As if sensing his thoughts, Melanie began to tremble again. The constant moving, the fear, the hunger, it was all taking its toll on her fragile psychological state. Thomas had noticed her episodes becoming more frequent, more severe. She needed stability, proper medical care, regular meals, all the things he couldn't provide while they were running. In the faint light that filtered through the windows, Thomas pulled out the newspaper clipping about the grandmother. Eleanor Sullivan, age 78, resident of a small town in Connecticut, seeking information about her missing granddaughter. The article mentioned she'd been searching for months, ever since her son had disappeared with the child. Her son, the scratched-out face in the photo. Thomas felt a piece of the puzzle click into place, but the picture it revealed only raised more questions. What had driven a father to disappear with his child, only to hand her off to a hired caregiver? And why had that caregiver been paid so handsomely to keep Melanie hidden? A racking cough from Melanie interrupted his thoughts. The sound was deep, concerning. Nothing like the small cold she'd had before. In the dim light, he could see her cheeks were flushed despite the basement's chill. When he touched her forehead, the skin burned under his palm. Panic rose in his throat. They had no medicine, no way to treat what was clearly becoming a serious illness. The constant moving, the stress, the poor nutrition, it had all caught up with her. Her small body was giving out under the strain. Thomas felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him. He'd run to protect her, but in doing so had he only put her in more danger. The fever radiated through her thin pajamas, and her breathing had taken on a worrying wheeze. Outside, the first light of dawn began to creep over Brooklyn. Soon, the streets would fill with workers, making any movement more dangerous. But as he held Melanie's burning body close, Thomas knew they were running out of options. She needed medical help regardless of the risk. In his former life, he'd been on the board of several hospitals. He knew their procedures, their weak points, their staffing patterns. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to get her the help she needed without exposing them. But as Melanie's fever climbed and her breathing grew more labored, a terrible realization settled over him. He might have to sacrifice their anonymity to save her life. The sound of early morning traffic began to filter through the basement windows. Somewhere above them, the city was waking up, unaware of the drama unfolding in its forgotten spaces. Thomas held Melanie closer, feeling her body burn with fever, knowing that the next decision he made could either save her or destroy everything they'd sacrificed to protect. Dawn broke over Brooklyn with an indifferent beauty, painting the industrial wasteland in shades of gold that belied the desperation within the old textile factory's basement. Melanie's condition had deteriorated rapidly through the night. Her breathing came in shallow gasps, and her small body alternated between burning fever and concerning chills. Thomas had stripped down to his undershirt, wrapping his dress shirt around her like a blanket, trying to regulate her temperature. The expensive fabric, now dirty and wrinkled, was a far cry from its former pristine state, much like Thomas himself. His own body ached from spending nights on concrete floors, and hunger gnawed constantly at his stomach. But none of that mattered. As he watched Melanie's struggle, the morning light revealed the true severity of her condition. Her lips had taken on a slightly bluish tinge, and dark circles shadowed her eyes. The cough that had started the night before now came in violent spasms that left her gasping for air. Each episode threatened to trigger her neurological condition, creating a dangerous cycle that could push her body beyond its limits. Thomas knew they had reached a breaking point. The child needed medical attention, not just for the fever, but for everything. Her malnutrition, her neurological condition, the toll that months of running had taken on her small body. The thought of walking into a hospital terrified him, but watching her suffer was unbearable. He gathered their few remaining possessions, trying to think through their options. The major hospitals would be too risky. Too many security cameras, too many people who might recognize him from his business days. But he remembered a small clinic in Red Hook, one he'd helped fund years ago through his corporation's charitable foundation. The staff there had been dedicated to helping the community's most vulnerable, often without asking too many questions. As he lifted Melanie into his arms, her head lolled against his shoulder, too weak even to hold itself up. The weight of her, so much lighter than she should be, sent a sharp pain through his heart. Had his desperate attempt to protect her only caused more harm? They emerged from the basement into the early morning light, Thomas trying to keep to the shadows of the buildings. Melanie's fever burned through his shirt, and her breathing had become increasingly labored. Every step felt like a gamble with her life. The streets were starting to fill with early morning workers. Thomas pulled the hood of his jacket lower over his face, trying to shield both their identities from curious eyes. But Melanie's condition made discretion impossible. Her coughing fits drew concerned glances from passers-by, and he could hear whispers following in their wake. Halfway to the clinic, disaster struck. A delivery truck backfired nearby, the sound echoing off the buildings like a gunshot. The noise triggered something in Melanie, perhaps a memory, perhaps just the culmination of too much stress on her fragile system. Her body went completely rigid in his arms, her eyes rolling back as she entered the worst episode he'd ever witnessed. Thomas ducked into an alley, cradling her convulsing form. This was different from her usual episodes, more violent, more dangerous. Her fever combined with the neurological event was creating a perfect storm in her small body. He could feel her heart racing erratically under his hands. "Please," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Please, Melanie, stay with me." But she was beyond hearing him now, lost in whatever dark place her mind retreated to during these episodes. Her skin had taken on a grey pallor, and her breathing became increasingly irregular. A shadow fell across them, and Thomas looked up to see a woman in scrubs standing at the entrance to the alley. She must have been heading to or from a shift at one of the nearby medical facilities. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene, the disheveled man holding a clearly ill child. "She needs help," the woman said. It wasn't a question. She was already pulling out her phone. Thomas wanted to run, to protect their anonymity, to maintain the fragile safety they'd built in their invisibility. But Melanie's body had gone alarmingly still in his arms, her breath coming in tiny, ineffective gasps. The choice was being taken from him by the cruel hand of circumstance. The woman was speaking rapidly into her phone, calling for an ambulance. Thomas could hear sirens in the distance, growing closer. Soon, their carefully maintained anonymity would shatter. Their images would be updated in the media, no longer the mysterious millionaire and his possible victim, but a desperate man and a critically ill child. As the sirens grew closer, Thomas looked down at Melanie's face. In her unconscious state, the worry lines that had aged her far beyond her 6 years had smoothed out. She looked for a moment like the child she should have been, peaceful, protected, safe. The bitter irony of that illusion wasn't lost on him. The woman in scrubs approached cautiously, her hands raised to show she meant no harm. "The ambulance is coming," she said softly. "Please, let us help her." Thomas felt tears sliding down his face as the weight of their situation crashed over him. All his resources, all his careful planning, all his desperate attempts to protect her, none of it had been enough. The sound of the approaching ambulance grew louder, and with it, the certainty that everything was about to change. The fluorescent lights of Brooklyn Methodist Hospital's emergency room cast harsh shadows across Thomas's face as he watched the medical team work on Melanie. They had whisked her away immediately upon arrival, her small body dwarfed by the gurney, while security personnel kept a watchful eye on him. The same photo that had gone viral days ago was now being passed among the hospital staff on their phones, accompanied by whispered conversations and suspicious glances. Thomas sat in a hard plastic chair, his hands trembling, clothes still damp with Melanie's fever sweat. The nurse who'd found them in the alley, Sandra Martinez as her ID badge revealed, had accompanied them in the ambulance. She now stood near the entrance of Melanie's treatment room, alternating between watching the medical team's efforts and studying Thomas with a mix of concern and uncertainty. Through the glass partition, he could see Melanie's face partly obscured by an oxygen mask. Her skin appeared almost translucent under the medical lights, dark circles under her eyes more pronounced than ever. The doctors moved with an urgency that made his stomach clench. Words like severe pneumonia and possible sepsis drifted through the air, each one hitting him like a physical blow. A security guard shifted closer to Thomas's chair, hand resting meaningfully on his radio. They hadn't detained him yet, but it was clear he wasn't free to leave. The local news vans were already gathering outside. Someone must have tipped them off. Thomas could see their lights flashing through the emergency room's windows, like vultures circling their prey. "Mr. Ramirez," a firm voice called. A doctor in her 50s approached, her face etched with gravity. "I'm Dr. Chen. We need to discuss the child's condition, and I need honest answers." She sat across from him, clipboard in hand. Behind her, 2 men in suits, hospital administrators, probably legal team, watched intently. She's experiencing acute respiratory distress, complicated by what appears to be a severe neurological event, Dr. Chen continued. Her blood work shows signs of prolonged malnutrition, and there's evidence of previous episodes similar to what she experienced today. We need her medical history. Now. Thomas's throat felt like sandpaper. She has a condition, neurological. Episodes triggered by trauma. I don't know the full medical details. I've only been caring for her for the past few months. And you are her? Dr. Chen left the question hanging. I found her, Thomas whispered, knowing how it sounded. She was alone, traumatized. Every time I tried to take her to authorities, she would have an episode. I couldn't leave her to the system. Not after what I'd seen in my own childhood. The suits behind Dr. Chen exchanged glances. One pulled out a phone, stepping away to make a call. Thomas knew what was coming. Police, child services, the full weight of the system he'd been trying to protect Melanie from. She's crashing! A shout from the treatment room sent Dr. Chen running. Thomas stood instinctively, only to be firmly pushed back into his chair by the security guard. Through the glass he watched in horror, as Melanie's body convulsed on the bed, the monitors beside her screaming in alarm. The next hours passed in a blur of medical terminology and increasing scrutiny. Police officers arrived, taking positions at every exit. Detectives interviewed the nurse who'd found them, while hospital staff pored over Melanie's test results. Thomas remained in his chair, a tight knot of despair growing in his chest as Melanie's condition continued to deteriorate. Late into the night, Dr. Chen returned. The lines in her face had deepened. The infection has spread to her bloodstream. Her body is too weak to fight it effectively, and these neurological episodes are putting additional strain on her system. We're doing everything we can, but... She paused, choosing her words carefully. She needs more than just medical treatment. She needs stability, a sense of safety. Mr. Ramirez, if there's any family we can contact... Thomas pulled out the crumpled newspaper clipping about Eleanor Sullivan, the grandmother in Connecticut. There might be someone, he said quietly, but I don't know if reaching out to her will help or make things worse. The person who had Melanie before me, who was paid to keep her hidden, I never found out why. Dr. Chen studied the clipping, her expression softening slightly. Right now, that little girl is fighting for her life. Whatever complicated situation led to this moment, her survival matters more than any secrets. Commotion at the emergency room entrance drew their attention. More police had arrived, accompanied by stern-faced men in suits. Not hospital administrators this time, but federal agents. One of them carried a file with Thomas's photo clipped to the front. Dr. Chen looked at Thomas with a mix of sympathy and resignation. Whatever you're running from, whatever you're trying to protect her from, time's up. That child needs every chance she can get right now. If this woman is really her grandmother, she deserves to know. Through the glass, Thomas watched Melanie's chest rise and fall with the help of machines. Her face, usually so guarded, looked impossibly young and vulnerable. The weight of every decision he'd made, every step that had led them here, pressed down on him like a physical force. The federal agents were approaching his chair, their expressions grim. In these final moments of freedom, Thomas made one last desperate decision. He turned to Dr. Chen and began to talk, spilling out everything he knew about Melanie's past, about Sarah Henderson, about the mysterious payments and the scratched-out photo. As he spoke, he prayed that somehow in this sterile hospital room under the unforgiving lights, the truth might finally help instead of hurt. The interrogation room at the Brooklyn Police Department's Special Victims Unit felt suffocating, its gray walls closing in as Thomas recounted his story for the third time. Detective Sarah Reeves, a veteran officer with kind eyes and steel in her voice, sat across from him, while federal agents observed through the two-way mirror. "Let's go through this again," Detective Reeves said, spreading photographs across the table. "You found her 4 months ago in the parking garage of your Manhattan building." She tapped the first photo, security camera footage showing Thomas approaching a huddled figure in the corner of the garage. "Yes," Thomas replied, his voice hoarse from hours of questioning. "It was raining. She was just sitting there, wrapped, in that coat, not making a sound. I tried to talk to her, but she wouldn't respond. When I reached for my phone to call the police, she started trembling so violently I thought she was having a seizure." The detective nodded, moving to the next photo. Sarah Henderson, the fake mother, captured by an ATM camera withdrawing a large sum of cash the day before she disappeared. "And you started investigating her background after you found medical records in the child's belongings?" Thomas leaned forward, pressing his palms against the cool metal table to stop their shaking. He hadn't slept in 36 hours, and worry about Melanie's condition gnawed at him constantly. The records were incomplete, deliberately redacted, but they showed a pattern of neurological episodes triggered by severe emotional trauma. Someone had gone to great lengths to hide the cause. "Which led you to start liquidating your assets," Detective Reeves continued. "Selling your company shares, emptying accounts, abandoning your penthouse, all while harboring a missing child." Her tone remained neutral, but the implications were clear. "I knew how it would look," Thomas admitted, "but every time I tried to turn her over to authorities, she would have an episode. I've seen what happens to traumatized children in the system. I lived it. I couldn't do that to her." The detective's expression softened slightly. She pulled out another document, Thomas's own childhood records from the Massachusetts state home. "Yes, we found those records. Abandoned at age 13, multiple foster placements, aged out of the system at 18. She paused, studying his face. "It colored your judgment with Melanie, didn't it?" Before Thomas could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Another detective entered, handing Detective Reeves a file. As she read, her eyebrows rose. "We found Eleanor Sullivan," she said finally. "The grandmother. She's been cooperative, provided DNA samples for testing. But there's something else." She spread new documents on the table. Bank records, court filings, death certificates. Melanie's father, James Sullivan, was involved in a federal investigation before he disappeared with her. Corporate fraud, embezzlement, millions of dollars missing from investment accounts. He was found dead 3 months ago in a hotel room in Nevada. Apparent suicide. Thomas felt the room spin slightly. That's when Sarah Henderson disappeared. With Melanie. Exactly, Detective Reeves confirmed. Henderson was hired by Sullivan to keep Melanie hidden while he tried to move the stolen money. When he died, she took her payment and vanished, leaving Melanie behind, probably worried the girl could identify her. The pieces were falling into place, but Thomas barely registered them. His thoughts were back at the hospital with Melanie. "How is she?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Please, I need to know if she's going to be okay." Detective Reeves's face grew serious. "Her condition is still critical. The doctors are doing everything they can, but..." She hesitated. The stress of the past few months, the malnutrition, the repeated neurological episodes, they've taken a severe toll on her body. Thomas buried his face in his hands, guilt crushing him. He'd tried so hard to protect her, but had his actions only made things worse. "There's something else you should know," Detective Reeves added quietly. "Eleanor Sullivan recognized you from the media coverage. She remembered you from a charity event 3 years ago. Your company had donated to a children's trauma center she worked with." Thomas looked up sharply, a distant memory surfacing. An elderly woman thanking him at some fundraiser, talking passionately about helping children overcome trauma through art therapy. He'd written a check, posed for photos, and forgotten about it in the rush of business deals and board meetings. "She's asking to speak with you," Detective Reeves continued. "Not as a suspect or witness, but as the man who, despite his misguided methods, tried to protect her granddaughter." The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Thomas absorbed this information. Outside the interrogation room, he could hear phones ringing, voices discussing cases, the normal bustle of a police station. But in here, time seemed suspended as he faced the consequences of every choice he'd made. "Before I agree to meet her," Thomas said finally, "I need to know one thing. Will Melanie be safe now? Really safe?" Detective Reeves gathered the photographs and documents, her movements deliberate. "Eleanor Sullivan has an excellent reputation in child welfare circles. She spent her life helping traumatized children heal. And unlike you, she can provide that help legally, with proper medical support and oversight. The words stung, but Thomas knew they were true. He'd done what he thought was right, but his own trauma had clouded his judgment, led him to choices that had ultimately put Melanie at greater risk. "Take me to her," he said quietly. "To Eleanor. It's time to stop running." The hospital chapel was empty when Thomas entered, save for an elderly woman sitting in the front pew. Eleanor Sullivan's silver hair caught the colored light from the stained glass windows, creating a halo effect that made her appear both fragile and timeless. She didn't turn as his footsteps echoed on the worn marble floor, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Detective Reeves had removed his handcuffs for this meeting, a small mercy that somehow made Thomas feel more vulnerable, not less. He stopped several feet from the pew, his body aching from days of tension and sleepless nights. "I used to bring Melanie here," Eleanor said quietly, still facing forward. "Every Sunday morning, before all this started. She would count the colors, in the windows, make up stories about the patterns they made on the floor." Her voice carried the weight of lost moments, of memories interrupted by tragedy. Thomas remained standing, uncertain of his place in this intimate recollection. "I've seen her do that," he said softly. "With her buttons, creating patterns, organizing them by color. It seems to calm her during the episodes." Eleanor finally turned to face him. Her eyes were red-rimmed but clear, studying him with an intensity that made him want to look away, but he forced himself to meet her gaze, to face whatever judgment she had for him. "Sit with me, Mr. Ramirez," she said, patting the space beside her. "Let's talk about how we both failed her, in our own ways." The words caught him off guard. He'd expected accusations, anger, not this quiet sharing. Of guilt. Slowly, he lowered himself onto the pew, maintaining a respectful distance. "The doctors say her fever has stabilized," Eleanor continued, "but she's still not responding to treatment as well as they'd hoped. Her body is fighting, but—" She trailed off, her hands tightening around each other. "I'm sorry," Thomas whispered, the words feeling desperately inadequate. "I thought I was protecting her. I thought the system would only hurt her more. Like it hurt you." Eleanor's question was gentle, but it struck like a physical blow. "Detective Reeves shared your background with me. 13 is such a vulnerable age to be abandoned. The same age my son was when his father died, actually." She reached into her bag, pulling out a worn photo album. "James was always a sensitive child. His father's death broke something in him that never quite healed. He threw himself into his work, became obsessed with success, with proving his worth through wealth." She opened the album, revealing pictures of a young man with Melanie's eyes. When his wife died in childbirth with Melanie, that obsession turned darker. The fraud, the stolen money. It was all part of his desperate need to create some kind of legacy, to feel in control. Thomas watched as she turned the pages, showing Melanie's progression from infant to toddler, to the quiet child he knew. He became convinced that everyone was trying to take her away from him. When the investigation started closing in, Eleanor's voice caught. "He took her and ran. I searched for months, but he'd hidden their tracks too well." "Sarah Henderson," Thomas said quietly. "The caregiver he hired." Eleanor nodded. A professional childminder with a history of working with wealthy private clients. No questions asked, complete discretion. When James realized he couldn't escape the investigation, She closed the album, her hands trembling slightly. He made arrangements for Melanie's care, then checked into that hotel in Nevada. His last act was to ensure she would be hidden, protected from what he saw as a threatening world. But Henderson abandoned her instead, Thomas finished, left her alone in that parking garage. "Where you found her," Eleanor said, finally turning to face him fully. "You, with your own wounds from abandonment, your own fears of the system. You saw yourself in her silence, didn't you?" Thomas felt tears burning in his eyes. "Every time I looked at her, I saw that 13-year-old boy sitting on the steps of the group home, watching his mother's car drive away. I couldn't let her feel that kind of rejection again." "So you ran," Eleanor said. "Gave up everything to keep her safe, but in doing so you denied her the chance to heal, to get the help she desperately needed. Just as I failed her by not searching harder, by not finding her before James's paranoia destroyed everything. A nurse appeared at the chapel door, her expression urgent. "Mrs. Sullivan? Dr. Chen needs to see you immediately. It's about Melanie." Eleanor rose quickly, her composure cracking slightly. She turned to Thomas, who had also stood, his heart racing with fresh fear. "Come with me," she said, holding out her hand. "Whatever happens next, she needs both of us to be strong enough to put her needs first. No more running, no more hiding." Thomas stared at her offered hand, seeing in it both absolution and responsibility. The chapel's stained glass cast shifting patterns across their feet, reminiscent of Melanie's careful arrangements of buttons and colors. With a deep breath, he took Eleanor's hand, and together they walked toward whatever news awaited them, leaving behind the weight of their separate guilts in the quiet sanctuary. The pediatric intensive care unit was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of monitors and the soft hiss of oxygen. Dr. Chen met them outside Melanie's room, her face bearing the careful neutrality that experienced doctors learn to maintain in critical moments. "Her fever has spiked again," she said without preamble. "The antibiotics aren't working as effectively as we'd hoped, and she's had another neurological episode. We've had to sedate her to prevent further strain on her system." Through the glass, Thomas could see Melanie's small form almost lost among the medical equipment. Tubes and wires created a complex web around her, each one measuring, monitoring, trying to support her failing body. Her skin had taken on a waxy pallor that made his chest tighten with fear. Eleanor's hand gripped his arm with surprising strength. "What are our options?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her fingers. Dr. Chen gestured them toward a small consultation room. Inside, the harsh fluorescent lights made everyone look sickly, adding to the gravity of the moment. "We've identified the bacterial strain causing the pneumonia," she explained, pulling up images on a computer screen. "It's resistant to standard antibiotics, likely due to her weakened immune system and the prolonged period without proper medical care." The accusation in those last words hung in the air. Thomas felt them like physical blows, each one deserved. "There's a new treatment protocol," Dr. Chen continued, "but it's aggressive. Given Melanie's current condition, it carries significant risks. However, without it—" She let the sentence hang unfinished, its meaning clear. Eleanor sank into one of the chairs, her earlier strength seeming to fade. "Will it hurt her?" she asked softly. "This treatment?" "She'll be sedated throughout the process," Dr. Chen assured her. "But yes, it will be hard on her body. The next 48 hours will be critical." Thomas remained standing, his body rigid with tension. "What about her neurological condition, these episodes she keeps having?" "That's the other concern," Dr. Chen said, pulling up another set of scans. "The repeated episodes have created a dangerous cycle. The physical stress triggers more episodes, which in turn weaken her body further. We need to break this cycle, but first we have to get the infection under control." Eleanor pulled out the worn photo album she'd been carrying, opening it to a picture of Melanie on what must have been her 4th birthday. In it, she was smiling, a real smile that reached her eyes, so different from the guarded expression Thomas had known. "She was such a happy child," Eleanor whispered. "Before James's paranoia took over, before all of this—" Dr. Chen's pager buzzed, interrupting the moment. She checked it, her expression tightening. "Melanie's temperature is still climbing. We need to make a decision about the treatment now." Eleanor looked up at Thomas, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "You've been making decisions for her these past months. What do you think?" The weight of that question pressed down on him like a physical force. He thought of all the choices he'd made, each one believing he was protecting Melanie, each one ultimately adding to her suffering. "I think," he said slowly, "that I need to stop deciding what's best for her, based on my own fears." He moved to the window overlooking the hospital's courtyard, where a small garden offered a quiet space for patients and families. "When I found her in that garage, I saw myself in her silence. I let my own trauma guide my actions, instead of seeing what she really needed. She needs proper care, proper healing, things I couldn't give her while we were running. Eleanor joined him at the window, her reflection overlapping with his in the glass. We all failed her in different ways, she said quietly. James by letting his fears destroy their lives. Me by not finding her sooner. You by trying to protect her the wrong way. But now we have a chance to do better. Dr. Chen cleared her throat gently. The treatment team is ready. Mrs. Sullivan, as Melanie's legal guardian, we need your consent. Eleanor straightened her shoulders, some of her earlier strength returning. Do it, she said firmly, whatever it takes to save her. As Dr. Chen left to give the orders, Eleanor turned to Thomas. Will you stay? She asked. Not just for the treatment, but after. She trusts you despite everything. That trust could be important for her recovery. Thomas looked through the window into Melanie's room, where nurses were already preparing for the new treatment protocol. The child who had changed his entire life lay there, fighting for her own. I'll stay, he said, but this time I'll do it the right way. No more running, no more hiding. She deserves better than that. The next hours blurred together in a haze of medical procedures and tense waiting. Thomas and Eleanor took turns sitting with Melanie, talking to her softly, even though she couldn't respond through the sedation. They shared stories, Eleanor about Melanie's early years, Thomas about their months together, both trying to bridge the gap between what was lost and what might still be saved. As night fell over Brooklyn, the hospital lights created islands of harsh clarity in the growing darkness. In Melanie's room, the monitors continued their steady rhythm, marking each moment of her fight for survival. Thomas watched through the glass as Eleanor gently brushed Melanie's hair back from her forehead, singing softly, a grandmother's love finally able to reach across the distance created by fear and desperation. The first rays of dawn crept through the hospital windows, marking the 36th hour of Melanie's aggressive treatment. Thomas sat in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed, his body aching from lack of sleep, his eyes fixed on the monitors that tracked her vital signs. Eleanor had finally agreed to get some rest in the family waiting room, though only after extracting a promise that he would wake her if anything changed. The doctors had warned them that these hours would be the hardest. Melanie's small body was fighting not just the infection, but also the powerful medications meant to save her. Her fever still raged, though not quite as high as before, and the episodes of neurological distress had decreased under heavy sedation. A soft knock at the door drew his attention. Dr. Chen entered, accompanied by a new face, a petite woman with silver-streaked dark hair and kind eyes. Mr. Ramirez, this is Dr. Sarah Winters. She's one of the country's leading pediatric neurologists specializing in trauma-induced conditions. Dr. Winters moved to Melanie's bedside, studying the monitors before turning to Thomas. I've reviewed Melanie's case, she said quietly. The pattern of her episodes, combined with her physical symptoms, suggests something I've seen before in children who've experienced severe emotional trauma. Thomas straightened in his chair, fully alert despite his exhaustion. What do you mean? The mind has powerful ways of protecting itself, Dr. Winters explained, pulling up a chair. In children especially, severe trauma can manifest in physical symptoms. What we're seeing with Melanie, these episodes of complete shutdown, it's her mind's way of trying to escape when it feels threatened. Like a circuit breaker, Thomas murmured, remembering how Melanie would freeze at the slightest hint of authority figures or institutional settings. Exactly, Dr. Winters nodded. But this protective mechanism has become dangerous. Each episode puts immense stress on her body, which in turn triggers more episodes. It's a cycle that's literally killing her. The harsh truth of those words hung in the air. Thomas reached out to touch Melanie's hand, careful not to disturb the IV lines. Her skin felt cooler than before, but still too warm. Can you help her? There's a treatment approach that's shown promise in similar cases, Dr. Winters said, but it's not just medical. The key is creating an environment where her mind no longer feels the need to protect itself so drastically. She needs to feel completely safe, not just physically, but emotionally. That's why she connected with you, Dr. Chen added gently. Despite the difficulties of your situation, You provided something she desperately needed. Unconditional protection, even at great personal cost. Thomas felt tears burning in his eyes. But I failed her. Look where we are now. You made mistakes, Dr. Winters acknowledged, but your instinct to protect her wasn't wrong. It was just incomplete. She needs more than protection. She needs healing, proper medical care, and a chance to process her trauma in a healthy way. A slight change in the monitor's rhythm caught their attention. Melanie's fingers had twitched in Thomas's hand, the first voluntary movement they'd seen in days. Dr. Chen moved quickly to check her vital signs. Her fever's dropping, she announced, a note of cautious optimism in her voice. And her oxygen? Levels are improving. Should I wake Eleanor? Thomas asked, hope making his voice shake. Let's wait a bit, Dr. Chen advised. These are good signs, but the next few hours are still critical. We need to start reducing the sedation slowly. See how she responds. Throughout the morning, they carefully began decreasing Melanie's medication. Eleanor returned, taking up her post on the other side of the bed, her presence adding to the circle of protection around her granddaughter. They watched anxiously for any sign of distress, any indication that reducing the sedation might trigger another episode. As afternoon approached, Melanie's eyes began to flutter. Thomas and Eleanor held their breath, while Dr. Chen and Dr. Winters monitored her closely. Slowly, gradually, her eyes opened, unfocused at first, then struggling to make sense of her surroundings. The moment they'd all feared arrived. Recognition dawned in her eyes, followed by the familiar sign of panic at finding herself in a hospital. Her heart rate began to climb, her body tensing in preparation for another neurological shutdown. "Melanie," Thomas said softly, squeezing her hand. "You're safe. Look at me. Remember the buttons. Let's count them together, just like we used to." Eleanor joined in, her voice gentle. "The blue ones first, sweetheart, just like we did every Sunday morning with the stained glass windows." Something in their combined voices seemed to reach her. The monitors showed her heart rate slowing, her breathing evening out. Her eyes darted between them, confusion evident in her expression. "That's it," Dr. Winters encouraged quietly. "She's fighting the episode. Keep talking to her. Keep her grounded in the moment." Thomas reached into his pocket with his free hand, pulling out the small collection of buttons they'd carried throughout their time together. He placed them on the bed where she could see them. "Remember how we arranged them? Blue, then green, then the special pearl one you said looked like a tiny moon." Melanie's eyes fixed on the buttons. Her hand trembled in his, but instead of going rigid with another episode, she slowly moved her fingers toward the familiar objects. Everyone in the room seemed to hold their breath as she touched the pearl button, her favorite. And then something extraordinary happened. Her lips moved, and though no sound came out, Thomas could read the word she formed. Moon. Eleanor's soft sob broke the tension in the room. Dr. Winters was quickly making notes, while Dr. Chen checked Melanie's vital signs again. But Thomas kept his eyes on Melanie's face, watching as tears began to roll down her cheeks. Not tears of fear this time, but of release. She was coming back to them, finding her way through the walls her mind had built for protection. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but in that moment, surrounded by people committed to healing rather than just protecting her, Melanie had taken her first step toward true recovery. The next 2 weeks brought steady improvements, each small, victory celebrated like a miracle. Melanie's fever finally broke completely, and the infection cleared from her system. More importantly, her episodes became less frequent and less severe, as Dr. Winters worked with her using specialized trauma therapy techniques. Thomas remained at the hospital despite his pending legal issues, the authorities recognizing the therapeutic value of his presence. He had been granted supervised visits under the watchful eyes of both hospital security and social workers. Detective Reeves had made it clear that he would eventually have to face consequences for his actions, but for now, Melanie's recovery took precedence. One particularly memorable afternoon, about 3 weeks into her recovery, Melanie achieved what Dr. Winters called a breakthrough. They were in the hospital's children's garden, a small but peaceful space where patients could spend time outside under medical supervision. Melanie sat between Thomas and Eleanor on a wooden bench, her fingers idly sorting through her collection of buttons, which had grown thanks to donations from the hospital staff. "Tell me about this one," Eleanor encouraged softly, pointing to a new addition, a bright red button with a pattern that looked like tiny stars. Melanie touched it carefully, her movement still somewhat weak, but more confident than before. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper but clearly audible, she said, "Like Daddy's tie." The words hit Thomas and Eleanor like a physical force. It was the first time Melanie had voluntarily mentioned her father. Dr. Winters, who was observing nearby, made a subtle gesture for them to stay calm and let Melanie lead the conversation. "His Christmas tie?" Eleanor asked gently, her voice trembling slightly. Melanie nodded, picking up another button, a simple brown one. "He was sad," she said, her voice a little stronger. "Always sad after Mummy went away. Said we had to hide to be safe." Thomas felt his heart constricting. He'd spent months trying to protect her, not realizing she had already been carrying the weight of someone else's fears and pain. "But you're safe now," Eleanor assured her, wrapping an arm carefully around her granddaughter's thin shoulders. "No more hiding." Melanie looked up at Thomas, her eyes clearer and more present than he'd ever seen them. "You tried to help," she said simply, "like the moon button, always there even when it's dark." Thomas couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. Dr. Winters had explained that children often process trauma through symbols and simple associations. The fact that Melanie could now verbalize these connections was a huge step forward. Later, that evening after Melanie had fallen asleep, Thomas sat with Eleanor in the hospital cafeteria. They had developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by their shared love for Melanie and their mutual understanding of failure and redemption. "The DA's office called today," Eleanor said, stirring her untouched coffee. "They're willing to be lenient given the circumstances. Your cooperation with the investigation, the fact that you essentially saved her from abandonment. They're talking about probation, mandatory counseling, and community service instead. Terv jail time." Thomas nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders, even as another settled in its place. "What about Melanie? What happens next for her?" Eleanor's eyes softened. "She'll come home with me to Connecticut once she's strong enough. Dr. Winters has recommended an excellent child psychiatrist near us who specializes in trauma cases." She paused, then added, "The house has a garden. I thought we could plant some flowers, give her something to nurture and watch grow." "She'd like that," Thomas said quietly, remembering how Melanie used to arrange her buttons in patterns that looked like flower petals. "You could visit," Eleanor offered, "once the legal issues are settled. Not right away. She needs time to establish stability, to learn that she's secure without having to depend entirely on anyone person. But eventually, she should know that not everyone who comes into her life will disappear." Thomas stared down at his own coffee, watching the fluorescent lights create patterns on its surface. "I'd like that," he said finally. "To see her heal, to watch her become the child she was meant to be before fear and trauma changed everything." Through the cafeteria windows, the lights of Brooklyn twinkled in the darkness. Somewhere out there was the parking garage where this all began, the abandoned buildings where they had hidden, the streets they had fled through in terror. But those places no longer held power over them. The real journey, Melanie's journey toward healing, was just beginning. Back in her hospital room, Melanie slept peacefully for the first time in months, her beloved buttons arranged on the bedside table in a perfect circle around the pearl, one that looked like a moon. On the wall, cards from hospital staff and drawings from other pediatric patients created a colorful collage of hope and recovery. Dr. Winters had said that healing from trauma wasn't a straight line. There would be setbacks, difficult days, moments when the old fears would resurface. But as Thomas and Eleanor watched over Melanie's sleep, they understood that the difference now was that she wouldn't face those challenges alone. She had what every child deserves: people who would fight for her healing as fiercely as they had once fought to protect her. The next 2 weeks brought steady improvements, each small victory celebrated like a miracle. Melanie's fever finally broke completely, and the infection cleared from her system. More importantly, her episodes became less frequent and less severe as Dr. Winters worked with her using specialized trauma therapy techniques. Thomas remained at the hospital despite his pending legal issues, the authorities recognizing the therapeutic value of his presence. He had been granted supervised visits under the watchful eyes of both hospital security and social workers. Detective Reeves had made it clear that he would eventually have to face consequences for his actions, but for now, Melanie's recovery took precedence. One particularly memorable afternoon, about 3 weeks into her recovery, Melanie achieved what Dr. Winters called a breakthrough. They were in the hospital's children's garden, a small but peaceful space where patients could spend time outside under medical supervision. Melanie sat between Thomas and Eleanor on a wooden bench, her fingers idly sorting through her collection of buttons, which had grown thanks to donations from the hospital staff. "Tell me about this one," Eleanor encouraged softly, pointing to a new addition, a bright red button with a pattern that looked like tiny stars. Melanie touched it carefully, her movements still somewhat weak, but more confident than before. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper but clearly audible, she said, "Like Daddy's tie." The words hit Thomas and Eleanor like a physical force. It was the first time Melanie had voluntarily mentioned her father. Dr. Winters, who was observing nearby, made a subtle gesture for them to stay calm and let Melanie lead the conversation. "His Christmas tie?" Eleanor asked gently, her voice trembling slightly. Melanie nodded, picking up another button, a simple brown one. "He was sad," she said, her voice a little stronger. "Always sad after Mommy went away. Said we had to hide to be safe." Thomas felt his heart constricting. He'd spent months trying to protect her, not realizing she had already been carrying the weight of someone else's fears and pain. "But you're safe now," Eleanor assured her, wrapping an arm carefully around her granddaughter's thin shoulders. "No more hiding." Melanie looked up at Thomas, her eyes clearer and more present than he'd ever seen them. "You tried to help," she said simply, "like the moon button, always there, even when it's dark." Thomas couldn't speak past the lump in his throat. Dr. Winters had explained that children often process trauma through symbols and simple associations. The fact that Melanie could now verbalize these connections was a huge step forward. Later that evening, after Melanie had fallen asleep, Thomas sat with Eleanor in the hospital cafeteria. They had developed an unlikely friendship, bonded by their shared love for Melanie and their mutual understanding of failure and redemption. "The DA's office called today," Eleanor said, stirring her untouched coffee. "They're willing to be lenient, given the circumstances. Your cooperation with the investigation, the fact that you essentially saved her from abandonment. They're talking about probation, mandatory counseling, and community service instead of jail time." Thomas nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders even as another settled in its place. "What about Melanie? What happens next for her?" Eleanor's eyes softened. "She'll come home with me to Connecticut, once she's strong enough. Dr. Winters has recommended an excellent child psychiatrist near us who specializes in trauma cases." She paused, then added, "The house has a garden. I thought we could plant some flowers, give her something to nurture and watch grow." "She'd like that," Thomas said quietly, remembering how Melanie used to arrange her buttons in patterns that looked like flower petals. "You could visit," Eleanor offered, "once the legal issues are settled." "Not right away. She needs time. To establish stability, to learn that she's secure without having to depend entirely on any one person. But eventually, she should know that not everyone who comes into her life will disappear." Thomas stared down at his own coffee, watching the fluorescent lights create patterns on its surface. "I'd like that," he said finally. "To see her heal, to watch her become the child she was meant to be, before fear and trauma changed everything." Through the cafeteria windows, the lights of Brooklyn twinkled in the darkness. Somewhere out there was the parking garage where this all began, the abandoned buildings where they had hidden, the streets they had fled through in terror. But those places no longer held power over them. The real journey, Melanie's journey toward healing, was just beginning. Back in her hospital room, Melanie slept peacefully for the first time in months, her beloved buttons arranged on the bedside table in a perfect circle around the pearl, one that looked like a moon. On the wall, cards from hospital staff and drawings from other pediatric patients created a colorful collage of hope and recovery. Dr. Winters had said that healing from trauma wasn't a straight line. There would be setbacks, difficult days, moments when the old fears would resurface. But as Thomas and Eleanor watched over Melanie's sleep, they understood that the difference now was that she wouldn't face those challenges alone. She had what every child deserves, people who would fight for her healing as fiercely as they had once fought to protect her. 1 year later, on a crisp autumn morning in Connecticut, Thomas parked his modest sedan in front of Eleanor's Victorian home. The garden he'd heard about during those long hospital nights had flourished under Melanie's care, bright autumn flowers creating a welcoming path to the front door. His probation officer had approved this visit weeks ago, another milestone in the careful journey of rehabilitation and redemption. The past year had transformed them all. Thomas had sold his remaining assets, using much of the money to establish a foundation for traumatized children, working closely with the same child trauma center where Eleanor had once volunteered. The legal system had been surprisingly merciful, recognizing that his actions, though misguided, had ultimately saved Melanie from a worse fate. The front door opened before he could reach it. Melanie stood there, 7 years old now and barely recognizable from the frightened child he'd found in that parking garage. Her cheeks were flushed with health, her eyes clear and present. She wore a blue dress with carefully sewn buttons down the front. Eleanor had taught her to sew, turning her fascination with buttons into a creative outlet. "You came," she said simply, her voice strong and sure. The neurological episodes had gradually decreased over the months of therapy, though Dr. Winters had warned they might never disappear completely. But Melanie had learned to manage them, to recognize the triggers and use the coping techniques she'd been taught. "I promised I would," Thomas replied, keeping his distance until she indicated she was comfortable with his presence. Dr. Winters had emphasized the importance of letting Melanie control her interactions, of building trust through respect for her boundaries. A smile broke across her face, a real uninhibited smile that still caught him off guard every time he saw it. She stepped forward and took his hand, leading him into the house where Eleanor waited. The interior was warm and filled with light, so different from the dark places where they had hidden a year ago. Photos lined the walls, not just old ones of Melanie's early years, but new ones documenting her recovery and growth. There she was in the garden, planting her first flowers. There she was, with her new therapy dog, a gentle golden retriever who helped her through anxiety attacks. And there she was at her first art show at the local children's center, proudly displaying a collage made entirely of buttons. "Show him, sweetheart," Eleanor encouraged, gesturing to something on the coffee table. Melanie led Thomas to a carefully crafted memory box. Inside, arranged with perfect precision, lay familiar items. The pearl button that had been her favorite during their time together, the old photograph of her grandmother and father, and something new, a journal with a handmade button decorated. "Cover? Dr. Sarah helped me write it," Melanie explained, referring to Dr. Winters by the familiar name she now used. About everything that happened, the scary parts, but also the good parts, like when you found me and when Grammy came back to me. Thomas felt tears threatening but held them back, knowing Melanie needed him to be strong as she shared this vulnerable moment. "May I see?" he asked carefully. She nodded, opening the journal to a page filled with her careful handwriting. "I wrote about the buttons first," she said, "how they helped me feel safe when nothing else did, and about how you understood that, even though you didn't know why." Eleanor joined them, sitting on Melanie's other side. The three of them, once strangers thrown together by tragedy, now connected by something deeper than circumstance. "I'm not scared anymore," Melanie announced, suddenly her voice clear and confident. "Dr. Sarah says it's okay to remember being scared, but I don't have to stay there. I can be like the flowers in the garden instead, growing new things from old dirt." Thomas and Eleanor exchanged glances over her head, both recognizing the wisdom in her words. The trauma that had brought them together had left its marks, but those marks had become like the patterns in a garden, part of a larger story of growth and renewal. Later that afternoon, As golden light filled Eleanor's kitchen, they celebrated Melanie's progress with a small cake she had helped bake. She had decorated it herself, surrounding the edges with a careful pattern of candy buttons in rainbow colors. As they sat together at the kitchen table, Thomas realized that this moment of simple joy, of ordinary family celebration, was what he'd been trying to provide all along. "Will you come back?" Melanie asked as he prepared to leave, her hand slipping into his with the natural trust that had been so hard-won. "As often as I'm allowed," he promised. "Someone needs to help you plant those spring bulbs your grandmother mentioned." She hugged him then, a real hug, not the fearful clinging of their days on the run. Over her head, Eleanor smiled, her eyes bright with tears. They had all learned something profound through this journey, that true protection wasn't about running from fear, but about standing together to face it.